So today we begin our post-Easter sermon series on biblical character. And we are doing so by looking at and studying biblical characters. Isn't that clever? Double entendre there, snuck in. As we think about what the promise and the declaration of Easter means for us, it's central to our faith. And so the question we ask ourselves is, does that belief, does that faith that we so boldly proclaim on Easter, does it really have an impact on the rest of our lives? The way that we think about ourselves, the way we think about others, the way we treat others, the way we order our lives, do we continue to allow the message, the hope of Easter, to infect and change us and mold us in our everyday interactions? And so we want to look in this series at our characters, in the kind of character that we could and hopefully do have as we follow and allow ourselves to be filled by Christ. And so it was kind of cool that this week a number of you shared with me an article, a piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal by George Weigel, and he entitled it the character or the Easter effect. And Weigel pointed out something quite astonishing. Basically that this amazing historical thing happened. That we don't think about very much because the water that we swim in has been for thousands of years just Christian in the Western world. But he said it's quite phenomenologically incredible that a group of roughly few dozen people, men and women on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire in less than 200 years took this new offshoot faith that they had following this rabbi and his kind of strange radical teachings, a rabbi who, by the way, died at the end of his ministry, very unglorious ending, that this ragtag group of men and women on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire could, in just a little over 200 years, become the dominant cultural, political force in the Western world, and eventually in the world, Christianity. And what Weigel asks in his question, in his article, the Easter effect, is why did that happen? How does something like that take place? And for those of us who have grown up in a Christian culture, it's very easy for us to recognize and to point out and to even have experienced in our own lives places where the Christian faith, the religion, even the Bible has been used in not the best of ways, perhaps even in ways that have increased oppression. And for that, we're sorry, and that's too bad. But the fact of the matter is, what Weigel points out is that the reason that Christianity went from a handful of people on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire to being the dominant political moral force in the Western world, that it became Christianity, the religion of the empire, of the Roman Empire, was because Christians, these people that followed the teachings of Jesus Christ and worshiped Christ as Lord, these people were different. They acted different. They behaved differently because of their faith. In this time, and it's difficult for us to get there, but just think, 2,000 years ago, when the average lifespan was about half of what it is today. Why? Because life was hard. And the vast, vast majority of people, probably close to 95% of people, were serfs or were servants and didn't own hardly any land at all, if any. And from day to day, they worked hard from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. Right? And it was very common for someone to lose their life in a battle or a war, or for someone to lose their life in childbirth. Right? Poverty was rampant. It was a violent life. It was not easy. Whole generations could be wiped out by plagues or diseases that went through a town or a village. And Christians at this time, when they chose to believe in and follow Jesus Christ, the resurrected one, their lives looked different. And the way they treated each other was different. And the way they treated other people outside of their community was different. And it was compelling. And it was contagious. This is the way Weigel puts it. He said, Christianity modeled a nobler way of life than what was on offer elsewhere in the rather brutal society of the day. In Christianity, women were respected. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. They were the first apostles, right? They're leaders in the church. Women were respected as they weren't in classical culture. Obviously, we still have had a ways to go, still have a ways to go, but Women played a critical role in bringing men to the faith and attracting converts in an age of plagues. The readiness of Christians to care for all of the sick, not just their own, was a factor, as was their impressive witness to faith of countless martyrs. These Christians would go and care for sick people, of people they didn't even know. They would serve food to and care for the poor and the widows in other towns and places that weren't even related to them. Christians were different. They lived their lives differently than other people of the time. And it was in ways that people couldn't argue that it was good, and it was right, and it was compelling. And Weigel says, for theologians who like to think that it was arguments that won the day, we had the right beliefs, we had just the right doctrines or constructs, said this sort of historical reconstruction is not particularly gratifying, but it makes a lot of human sense. Christians lived differently. They were a people who modeled a nobler way of life. You know who he's talking about here? You. He's talking about us. We are people in today's world that no matter what's going on around us and how nasty people are or how sick people are or how much people are struggling, we model a nobler way of life. We love our enemies. We care for others. We don't live self-centered lives, we live others-centered lives. The Christians of the first century were so convinced, actually not initially, but eventually became so convinced that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, that even though life continued and history and society and humanity continued to struggle and life wasn't easy, Christians believed they had already understood what was coming. They had gotten to the end of the story. And the end of the story was resurrection and forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation. That's how it ends. And when you know that's how it ends, that infuses your current life with a level of boldness and joy and thanksgiving that's contagious. That leads you not to live a fearful life and a careful life of my tribe versus your tribe or your way versus my way, but no, all of us are children of God. I have nothing to fear, and so I'm going to work outside of myself. I'm going to do those dangerous and risky things. I'm going to live an adventurous life. I'm going to love with abandon because I know how this story ends. It was compelling. Weigel ends his article by saying this. He says that Christianity carried the day because of the curious and inexplicable joy that marked these Christians' lives. The curious and inexplicable joy. Do people say that about your life? Probably, sometimes, right? Could they say that more often about us? Probably. These are the kind of people, this is us, folks. This is who he's talking about. We are the people who model a nobler way. When other people are dragged down into nasty conversations or gossip, that's not what we do as followers of Jesus Christ, because we know how the story ends. We know it's about forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation and resurrection, so we live like Easter people. It infects our lives. You see it in our character. The Easter effect should be and is evident in our lives. Praise God. We just got done in Lent in the season of talking about what it means to love our enemies. And that's not easy. Jimmy McCarty last week talked about the division within Christians today. Whether it's liberal Christians or moderate Christians or mainline Christians or evangelical Christians. And goodness gracious, folks, in today's day, we need to be people who model a noble way of being. We need to be people, when people look at how we treat others and how we treat each other and how we talk about life and how we go through our days, that they recognize within us an infectious joy. Because we believe this Easter stuff. We really do, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at what it means for what should we be expecting of ourselves, what should we be seeing in ourselves in our own character, right? As we look at some different characters in the Bible and learn both from the via positiva and the via negativa characteristics and character flaws that we should maybe try to stay away from, and characteristics and strengths of character that we should perhaps try to accommodate into our own lives. So this morning we're going to begin by looking at a couple of characters, a couple of millennials, mixed race, multicultural millennials, one from about 2,000 years ago, one from 3,000 years ago. And the first one is a gentleman by the name of Timothy. Timothy was a young first century man whose father was Greek, would have been more European and spoke Greek. His mother was Jewish, which was a different culture and race at that time. Somehow his mom and dad met in Turkey and fell in love and got married and had children, but Timothy was raised as a Greek. We first, you probably have heard of Timothy before. There's a couple of books in the New Testament that are written to him, written by Paul to Timothy, as Timothy is a leader in the young church, First Timothy and Second Timothy. And in both of these books, Timothy is the leader of the church in Ephesus at this point, still a young man, small church in Ephesus that grew to be a large and influential church. And Paul talks to Timothy about his character. He says, you must be filled with, you must be without fault. Paul says in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, if you're to be a leader in the church, you need to be faithful to your spouse and sober and modest and honest. You should show hospitality and be skilled in teaching. You shouldn't be addicted to alcohol. You shouldn't be a bully. Don't be a bully. Instead, you should be gentle, peaceable, and not greedy. This is the kind of guy Timothy was. And people around him recognized that in him. And as he grew in age and in stature, he continued to grow in wisdom and humility and hold on to the teachings of Paul and others. The first time that we meet Timothy, though, is in the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles are the stories after Jesus had been raised from the dead, and the disciples were filled with the Spirit of Christ, and they became apostles. So disciples from learners, apostles are goers, people who go and share the good news. And so it's the story of the apostles, Peter and others, and Stephen, and then primarily focuses on the apostle Paul. And Paul, throughout his life, as you probably know, took a number of journeys. And the first journey is there in the green, if you can see that. That was his first short journey, a missionary journey that Paul took to tell people in that part of the world about Jesus, the Messiah. Paul was very much a Jewish man, trained in the law, was telling people about Christ who had come as the Messiah. And then his first time that he traveled through what would be eastern Turkey today. It's small, but you can see circled there the town of Lystra and Derbe. Paul preached there, and some of the people that were in Lystra at that time and heard his preaching became followers of Jesus, and one of those was Timothy, and his mother and his grandmother, who were both Jewish. They began to follow Christ and called themselves disciples of Christ. And it was the second time then in Paul's second missionary journey, as he was traveling through that same region, that we are introduced to Timothy. So I'm going to read from chapter 16 of the book of Acts, starting in verse 1. Paul reached Derbe and then Lystra, where he found a disciple named Timothy. Timothy was the son of a believing Jewish woman and a Greek father. The brothers and the sisters in Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. And so Paul wanted to take Timothy with him on his journeys, and so he circumcised him. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Really? I mean, talk about an odd get-to-know-you exercise, right? Listen, I think I like what I see here. I think you should come along with me. And Timothy's like, yeah, I think I want to go with you too. I want to follow Jesus. Okay, just this one little thing we need to do. Painful. Awkward. Why did Paul do this? Well, Paul did this because that's what you do. If you're a good follower of Yahweh, if you want to be a part of the people, the family of God, then men, you get circumcised. And so what Paul was doing, as he recognized a leader, a young man who had the gifts and the talents, the adventure, bilingual, I'm going to take you with me. You need to be one of us, and so I will circumcise you. And Timothy goes along with it. What I love about the Bible is that it's the best commentary on itself. You can always find some passage in the Bible and find another passage in the Bible that gives a different perspective or sometimes even a contrasting perspective on the exact same issue. The Bible is the best commentary on itself. That's why I love it, not because it is so uniform and you can pick it up anywhere and read the same thing and it's going to tell you exactly what to do, but because it's a complicated book filled with 66 different books. And you can watch literally as theology and practice evolve and the Spirit of God does a work through the writers and the experiences of the writers of the Scripture and the experiences and the mistakes and the successes that they have. Paul, in meeting Timothy for the first time, was still fairly young in his Christian faith, and so he did what his religious training, what his tradition told him to do as a good Jew, which is, I circumcise you. That's how you are marked as one who is a part of the family of God. You are a part of the family of Yahweh. You are one of us. And yet, however, probably in less than 2 years from then, Paul had started to see things differently. He had begun to travel with this Greek man, Timothy, and understood his character and his life. Paul spent more time with those outside of the Jewish community and traveled, got to know people from Rome and from Thessalonica and from Greece and from Turkey. And in the course of all of that, he realized that a lot of the strong religious traditional convictions that he had were maybe a little bit off. In fact, in Galatians 5, which Galatia is the area where Lystra is in, Paul writes this just a little bit later to some Christians who at that point were kind of insisting that everyone like him who becomes a Christian should get circumcised. Doesn't matter where you come from, that's the sign that you are a true follower of God in Christ. Paul writes this in Galatians. You people who are trying to be made righteous by the law have been estranged from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. We eagerly wait the hope of the righteousness through the Spirit of faith. Being circumcised or not being circumcised doesn't matter in Christ Jesus. But faith working through love does matter. In fact, that could be probably the most powerful and succinct way to put what Christian character is all about. Faith expressing itself in love. It could very well be that Timothy was the scribe that helped Paul to write this. And can you imagine Timothy as Paul is saying this? Like, what? Wait. Can you write that? Can you say that again? What? That's interesting. Paul's understanding, the Spirit of the living Christ's revelation in Paul's life and his understanding of what is true and what is right, Paul circumcised Timothy because it was the right thing to do. It was what tradition told him to do. It was right and true and pure. And yet God was doing a new thing. Here was Timothy, a young, well-respected, multi-ethnic young man willing to give his life and his service to advance the message of God's love in the Greek and Roman community. And Paul, probably without thinking as much as he possibly should have, acting upon strict religious doctrine and administering a painful rule that scarred Timothy, a rule that actually in the end they realized didn't matter. Timothy went on and traveled with Paul, taught and learned with him, taught Paul, and Paul learned from him. And then he was left in charge of the church in Ephesus and became bishop. Timothy's name appears as a co-author in 2 Corinthians and Philippians and Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, and Philemon. He was competent, he was courageous, he was young, he was multilingual, he was multicultural. And yet his body always bore the scar of a hasty traditional decision made by one of his elders. In your lives today, do you see these multicultural millennials? These young leaders in our land, do you see them? Yes? No? I see them everywhere, folks. People in our country who are 40 years old and older, 70% are white. People in our country who are 20 years old and younger, a majority of them are not white. The young leaders of our nation, of our church, of our society are going to be and look different than us. And their experiences and their background might seem strange to us. You've heard the term, it's Greek to me, right? Paul runs into this young, talented, multilingual, multiracial man, and he doesn't quite know what to do with the Greek in him, and so he cuts it out. And yet it was the Greek in Timothy that God was going to use to be able to proclaim the gospel and God's love in a more compassionate and powerful and in captivating way to people who would not have or could not have heard the gospel through the mouth of someone like Paul. This is Timothy. We have a lot to learn from him. And we have a lot to learn ourselves that we would not perhaps unknowingly be causing or expecting our young people today to conform, to be burdened by expectations or practices or traditions that might scar them that don't really matter. Our second character this morning, young adult, is Ruth. Ruth the Moabite, as she is known. Ruth is a small book that's found in the beginning of our Bible in the Old Testament. It's right between Judges and 1 Samuel, and it's there because it speaks of a time in Israel's history when the judges still ruled, and there were just these different kingdoms, tribes in the area of where Israel is today. Really, they believe, however, that's the setting, but they believe that Ruth was probably written much later on. Probably at the time when the Israelites were leaving captivity, when they had been in captive in Babylon, and they were returning and finally getting their way back to Israel in about the 400 BCE period. And they were frustrated, some of these righteous Jews who were coming back, because a lot of their brothers that they had left behind had married foreign women. And they said because of that had brought corruption into Israel. And so they believe that is the setting, actually, when the book of Ruth is written. Ruth is one of two books in the Bible that is named after a woman. And it is the only book in the Bible that is named after a foreign pagan woman, Ruth, the Moabite. And so the story of Ruth is that Naomi and her husband and their two sons live in Bethlehem, and there is a famine in Judah, which is the southern part of Israel, and because of that famine, they travel out to find food and jobs, and they end up in Moab. Moab was a kingdom that predated Israel, but it was a kingdom that the Israelites knew as one filled with people who were sexually immoral and incestuous. But because of the famine, that is where Naomi and her husband and their two sons found themselves. Soon after getting to Moab, Naomi's husband dies, we read. And then their two sons, it says, took two wives for themselves, Moabite women. The verb took wives for themselves, that taking is the same verb that's used for Israelite armies when they would go into foreign lands and defeat them and take wives and concubines. So I would doubt that this taking of Ruth and her sister Orpah was so much of a romantic affair. But nonetheless, Naomi's two sons take two wives, Ruth and Orpah. And sadly, after living together for a number of years, the two husbands die as well. At which point Naomi, who is devastated, tells her daughters-in-law that she is going back to Judah, back to Bethlehem, back to her home. And then Ruth and Orpah say, "No, we are going to go with you." Naomi tries to talk sense into them and says, No, you must remain here in your land. This is where you were born. This is where you will find your new husbands. Orpah turns away. But then the famous lines of Ruth appear where she says to her mother-in-law, "Do not urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." And so the two women make their way back into Judah, into Bethlehem, and it happens to be the time of the harvest. And so Naomi says, Ruth, this is what you should do. You should find a field. We need to find a field, and you should go and follow after the harvesters as they are harvesting the grain and pick up whatever you can. Gleaning, they called that. In fact, this practice of gleaning was written into the law of the Israelites. In both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God stipulates that as you take your harvest from the land, you're not supposed to clean all the crops. You're not supposed to take everything. In fact, you're not even supposed to harvest the edges or the corners of your field. Why? So that the widows and the orphans and the immigrants can come in after you and they can have something to eat as well. Isn't that interesting, the way that God builds that into the social fabric and the framework of the industry of the rhythms of life in Israel? And so that's what Ruth does. She finds a field and she begins to glean, and she brings the food back to her mother-in-law, and that's going well. And then they find out that the field that she is gleaning in happens to be owned by a distant relative of Ruth's, whose name is Boaz. A distant relative of Naomi's, who is Boaz. And so Naomi says to Ruth, this is great luck. You need to stay in that field, get to know him. He's a distant relative of mine. This is a good sign. And so Ruth does, and finally Boaz notices her and notices her and calls out to one of his servants and said, who does this woman belong to, this Moabite? And they said, oh, that's Ruth the Moabite. She belongs to Naomi, a distant relative of yours. And Boaz says, oh, that's interesting. And he introduces himself to her. Ruth explains this to her mother-in-law, and Naomi says, this is a good sign. This is what I want you to do. Tonight there's going to be a party, and Boaz is going to be doing a lot of eating and drinking. Figure out where he's going to be lying down, and when he does, after his night of heavy drinking, I want you to lie down next to him and lift the blanket and make yourself available. And she does so. And when Boaz wakes, he is startled, but also pleased. And in the morning, he goes and finds Naomi's closest next of kin, the one who has the right to take in Naomi and have Ruth as his own. And Naomi's closest kin says, that's okay, Boaz, you can have her. And so he does. And Boaz takes Ruth as his bride. And together, Ruth conceives. And the chapter 4 ends with these words. It says, she conceives and gives birth to a son. Naomi took the child and held him to her breast. Naomi took the child, Ruth's child, and held him to her breast, and she became his guardian. The neighborhood women gave the child a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. And Obed became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, king of Israel. And so the king of Israel, David, the king's great-grandmother, was a Moabite. It's interesting that even after she gives birth, the women in the neighborhood say, a child has been born to Naomi. There are many positive character traits that we can learn from somebody like Ruth. She is truly brave, resourceful, dependable, very, very hardworking, courageous, selfless, respectful, self-reliant, trusting, compliant, perhaps too compliant. And from Naomi and Boaz, we can learn many things. Kindness, justice, protection. We can celebrate and wish to emulate these characters, but as we did with Timothy and Paul, we can also see that there are some not so fantastic character traits or practices. Like Timothy, Ruth's compliance and obedience as an outsider was exploited at times. This story might challenge us and ask us if we are as faithful and hard-working and conscientious as Ruth, but it also might nudge us to ask ourselves, are there people, perhaps people in our society, in our lives, who are not of the majority culture, who have less power than us, that whether willingly or unwillingly we take advantage of their powerlessness or their obedience? Do we use people, whether we intend to or not, to attain our goals? And so it causes us to scan our lives and our relationships and wonder, are there places where we need to change how we think, how we act, how we treat others? It's interesting to note that throughout the book of Ruth, she is consistently spoken of as a foreigner, Ruth the Moabite. Ruth the Moabite. It's never just Ruth. The title of the book is the name of a foreigner, but it was written by an insider. And it's interesting how those of us who are in the majority culture do this, right? Not maybe intending to. Have you ever heard yourself? I've heard myself say this when you mention somebody, say, oh, he's my black friend. Right, or he's my kids, he's the Asian teacher. Right? I got to tell you, I never say, she's my white friend. Or that's that Caucasian preacher, right? In what ways do we use our majority status and the power that we have in a culture where we feel comfortable perhaps to think less of and perhaps even unwittingly exploit others? How do our multicultural youth today inspire us and challenge us as adults to be people of wisdom and character and integrity? The thing about growing in character is that it's not fun because the way you grow in character is after you fall down. You grow in character when you make mistakes. It's different than growing in natural strengths, things that you can work on and develop. Character is developed when we acknowledge or someone points out to us our brokenness or our errors. And we learn over time how to receive such wisdom and revelation with grace and perspective and to accept the hope of Easter, which is ours. As we reflect after this sermon, I wonder if you could mentally or perhaps with a pen make a list of these young adults in your life, these multicultural, interesting people who perhaps are Greek to you a little. And what if you wrote them a note, shot them an email, and recognized, affirmed, empowered, encouraged their unique perspectives and talents and their leadership? And that we would ask God to help us perhaps to be more like Timothy and Ruth in our faithfulness, in our commitment to others and the truth, in our hard work, in our response to the challenges and opportunities of life. And then finally, may we ask God to help us, those of us who've got a little bit more life under our belts, to never objectify or scar young people unnecessarily with assumptions and expectations that seem right to us at the time. May God give all of us the grace and the strength to live as Easter people, to be recognized and characterized as those with that wonderful and contagious joy and that depth of character that comes from a life well lived and a life well examined. May it be so in us.